You are at a dinner table. Someone pours you a glass of wine. You take a sip. Your shoulders drop half an inch without you noticing. The conversation gets easier. The lighting feels warmer. You think this is a modern comfort, a social lubricant invented for candlelit tables and clinking glasses. But the real answer is far stranger. The urge you just felt did not begin at that table. It began 10 million years ago in a tree, in the body of an ancestor who was not even human yet. This is the story of how a molecule shaped you before you had a name for it. Long before there were vineyards, long before there was bread or beer or a single word for celebration. There was fruit, ripe fruit, fallen fruit, fruit sitting on a forest floor in the heat. And when fruit sits like that, sugar inside it starts to break down. Wild yeast, floating invisibly in the air, lands on the skin and gets to work. It eats the sugar. It produces alcohol as a byproduct. This is fermentation, and it is not a human invention. It is a natural chemical accident that has been happening in forests for tens of millions of years, long before any primate stood upright. So the forest floor, especially in the tropics, was often faintly alcoholic, not intoxicating in the way a modern drink is, more like a whisper, a trace, but a trace that mattered because it told a hungry animal something important. It said, "This fruit is ripe, this fruit has sugar, this fruit is calories, and calories are survival." Here is where the story gets strange. In 2014, a biologist named Matthew Carrigan led a study looking at a gene called ADH4. This gene builds an enzyme, and an enzyme is just a tiny biological machine that speeds up a chemical reaction. The ADH4 enzyme's job is to break down alcohol in the body. Carrigan's team traced the history of this gene across dozens of species, going back tens of millions of years. What they found was remarkable. Around 10 million years ago, a single mutation appeared in the ancestor shared by humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. That mutation made the enzyme 40 times more efficient at breaking down alcohol. 40 times. Think about what that number means. It means an ancestor of yours gained, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, the ability to safely process a substance that would have made other animals sick or sluggish. Why would evolution favor that? Because that ancestor had just come down from the trees. Before this mutation, primates lived mostly in the canopy, eating fruit while it was still fresh and unfermented. But somewhere around 10 million years ago, the ancestors of humans, chimps, and gorillas began spending more time on the forest floor. And the forest floor is where fruit goes after it falls, overripe, soft, beginning to ferment. An animal that could not tolerate alcohol would eat that fruit and feel dizzy, uncoordinated, vulnerable to predators. An animal that could break alcohol down quickly could eat that same fruit, get the calories, and stay sharp enough to run if something came out of the underbrush. This idea has a name. Scientists call it the drunken monkey hypothesis, first proposed by biologist Robert Dudley. The theory is simple and a little humbling. Your tolerance for alcohol did not evolve so you could enjoy a drink. It evolved so a starving ancestor could eat rotting fruit off the ground without dying. You are, in a very real sense, descended from opportunists, from animals that looked at spoiled fruit and thought, "Close enough." Does that change how you think about the smell of a brewery? Or the reason a glass of beer can feel almost primal in a way you never asked it to? Move forward now. Millions of years pass. Bodies change, brains grow. Somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, something that looked and thought recognizably like you appeared on the plains of Africa. This is Homo sapiens, and this new species inherited that same efficient alcohol processing gene, tuned by millions of years of scavenging fallen fruit. But something else happened too, something bigger than biology. Around 50,000 years ago, give or take, humans began doing something no fruit-eating ancestor ever needed to do. They began deliberately making alcohol. not stumbling onto it in the wild, making it on purpose as a project. The earliest solid evidence for this comes from a place called Göbekli Cave on Mount Carmel in modern Israel. In 2018, archaeologists led by Liu and Dani Nadel published findings of stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock of the cave floor, dating back roughly 13,000 years. Inside those mortars, researchers found residue, starch granules that had been altered in a very specific way, malted and fermented. In other words, someone in that cave had been brewing something like beer 13,000 years ago. That is roughly 8,000 years before the pyramids of Giza were built, before writing existed, before anyone had planted a single field of wheat as a farmer would understand it. And yet someone was already soaking grain, letting it sprout just enough to release its sugars, and encouraging it to ferment into something you would recognize, in spirit if not in taste, as beer. This detail matters more than it seems, because for a long time, the standard story of human civilization went like this. Humans settled down. They started farming grain to make bread. Because they had reliable food, populations grew, villages formed, and civilization began. Beer, in that story, was an afterthought, a pleasant side effect of already having grain. But the evidence at Göbekli Cave and evidence from similar sites since pointed to something almost backward. The people brewing that ancient beer were not full-time farmers. They were still largely hunter-gatherers. They were fermenting wild grain before anyone had domesticated it into a reliable crop. This led an anthropologist named Solomon Katz, working with biochemist Mary Voigt, to propose something that sounded almost absurd when he first said it in the late 1980s. What if humans did not start farming grain in order to make bread? What if they started farming grain in order to keep making beer? He called it the beer before bread hypothesis. Here is the reasoning behind it. Wild grains like wheat and barley are actually a lot of work for very little food. You have to harvest them and separate the edible seed from the husk and grind them, and even then, the bread you get is dense, plain, and nutritionally unremarkable compared to meat or fruit. It is a strange food to build a civilization around if you are only thinking about it as bread. But if that same grain gets soaked in water and allowed to sprout slightly so its starches become sugars, and then left to sit while wild yeast does its ancient work, it becomes something else entirely, a calorie-dense, mildly alcoholic liquid, something that can be shared, something that, unlike a raw grain, is often safer to drink than untreated water in an early settlement, because the fermentation process kills many harmful microbes, something that frankly feels good to consume. Katz's argument was that this feeling might have been the real engine, that the pleasure and communal pull of fermented grain gave early humans a reason to do the incredibly tedious, repetitive work of collecting wild grass seeds year after year. Not for bland bread, for beer. Is it possible your ancestors' first real agricultural project, the very thing that eventually led to permanent villages, stored surpluses, and organized society, was built around getting a drink? Not every archaeologist agrees on how central this was. It is a hypothesis, not a settled fact, and the honest picture is probably more tangled. Grain was likely valued for food, for beer, and for other uses all at once in ways that reinforced each other rather than one single cause explaining everything. But the timeline is undeniable. Fermentation came very early, possibly earlier than farming itself, and once humans started farming on purpose, alcohol did not fade into the background. It moved to the center of the room. Consider Göbekli Tepe, a massive stone monument in what is now southeastern Turkey, dated to roughly 11,500 years ago. It is one of the oldest known monumental structures on Earth, built before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before anyone in that region had permanent farming villages in the way we usually imagine them. Archaeologists working the site, led over the years by Klaus Schmidt and later researchers, found large stone vats at the site. Chemical residue analysis on some of these vessels found evidence consistent with fermented grain, essentially the chemical fingerprint of ancient beer. Picture that, hunter-gatherer groups traveling from far away, converging on this one massive ritual site and drinking beer together as part of whatever ceremonies happened there. Before agriculture had fully taken hold, before cities existed, alcohol was already a reason for strangers to sit down together. There is a pattern hiding in plain sight here, and it says something about you specifically, not just about ancient history. Alcohol has almost never just been about the chemical effect. It has been about the room it creates, a reason to gather, a ritual to share, a reduction, however temporary, of the wall between one nervous system and another. Have you ever noticed that the moment a drink is poured at a gathering, the whole tone of the room shifts, even before anyone has actually taken a sip? That shift is not superstition. There is real neuroscience behind it. Alcohol works, in simple terms, by amplifying a calming brain chemical called GABA, while dampening an excitatory one called glutamate. Together, this slows down certain kinds of overthinking and self-monitoring. The part of your brain that constantly polices your words, your posture, your fear of saying the wrong thing gets quieter. That is why people describe feeling looser. Not because alcohol adds confidence from nowhere, but because it temporarily mutes the internal editor that was suppressing confidence you already had. And your ancestors 10,000 years ago, gathering at a site like Göbekli Tepe, were likely feeling some version of that exact same mechanism, the same GABA, the same quieted editor. The specific words and rituals have vanished into history. The biology has not moved an inch. This is where the story takes its sharpest turn. Because if alcohol only ever brought people closer, this would be a simple, warm story. It is not. The same chemical shortcut to connection has always carried a shadow side, and ancient humans knew it. Archaeological and early historical evidence, including some of the oldest written laws from ancient Mesopotamia, already contained rules about drinking. Regulations on how much beer a worker could be paid in. Restrictions and warnings about excess. This means that almost as soon as humans began writing anything down at all, they were already writing about the need to manage alcohol, not to invent the problem of overconsumption, to respond to a problem that was clearly already old. Your ancestors were negotiating with this substance for thousands of years before anyone diagnosed a single case of what you might now call an unhealthy relationship with drinking. The pattern is not new, only the language around it is. So here is the fuller, stranger shape of the story. A gene mutation 10 million years ago that let a starving primate eat fermenting fruit off a forest floor without losing its edge against predators. That same gene carried forward, quietly waiting in the human body for millions of years. Then deliberate fermentation, tens of thousands of years ago, turning an accident of biology into an intentional craft. Then possibly an entire agricultural revolution, partly driven by the desire to keep making it. Then massive ritual gathering sites, built partly around sharing it. Then some of the very first laws in written history, trying to contain it. None of that sounds like a modern invention for candlelit dinners. It sounds like one of the oldest continuous threads in the entire human story. Which brings you back to that glass of wine at the table. The warmth spreading through your chest is not new technology meeting an ancient body. It is an ancient body doing exactly what it has always done, using a slightly newer bottle. The part of you that softens at the first sip is the same part of an ancestor that once ate fallen fruit off a jungle floor, because the alternative was going hungry. The part of you that feels the room open up when a drink is shared is the same part that once gathered at a stone monument 11,000 years before written history, drinking something rough and unfiltered out of a shared vessel, feeling for a moment a little less alone in a hard world. You are not adopting an ancient behavior when you raise a glass. You are simply the latest version of a habit that is older than language, older than agriculture, arguably older than your own species. You did not learn to want this. You inherited it. So the next time someone pours you a glass and your shoulders drop that half an inch, remember what is actually happening underneath. That is not a modern comfort. That is 10 million years arriving right on time.